Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brandon Holveck. I'm a reporter with Delaware Online and the News Journal. I'm pleased to be joined today by the University of Delaware's Paul Brewer. He is the research director for the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication. And this morning, we're going to do our best to get you set up for what you should expect through the rest of the day and recap what you saw unfold yesterday, both here in the first state and across the country. Paul, we were talking a few minutes ago about kind of the loopiness we might have on this stream this morning. I'm sure a lot of people are up late last night and back up early this morning, but I hope you're hanging in there. Thanks for joining us.
And thanks for having me on here.
Great. So let's kind of get everybody reset on where we are with the presidential race. So USA Today, which we're a part of, our network has Biden at 238 electoral votes and Trump at 213. Obviously, need to get to 270. For Trump, the big wins yesterday were Iowa, Ohio, Florida, and I'm missing one off the top of my head.
Texas.
There we go. So some of those states that the Democrats thought, hey, maybe cross our fingers in a million years, maybe we'll get these, maybe we'll have the big blowout win. But Trump held on to those. The big win for Biden was Arizona, which hadn't gone to a Democratic president since 1992. But plenty still up in play where we are this morning. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Georgia, among others, all still in play. And we're starting to get updates about where we are with mail-in ballots this morning, which is obviously a big change from where we typically are on these election days where we've had results before. Paul, just kind of your overarching thoughts. What stood out to you last night as you watched those results roll in? And then we'll get into what we're kind of looking at today.
Yeah, so based on the polling and past results, I was kind of thinking there are four possible scenarios. A narrow Trump win, a narrow Biden win, kind of a comfortable Biden win, and a Biden landslide. The Biden landslide evaporated pretty quickly when the Florida results came in. And the comfortable win is maybe still like a modest version of that is maybe still on the table, depending on how things go in states like Georgia and North Carolina. A Biden narrow win is certainly still a possibility with how things go in terms of states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. The Arizona victory helps Biden a lot. A Trump narrow victory is still within the realm of possibility if he manages to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and hold Georgia and North Carolina as well. So some paths closed off pretty quickly. A number of scenarios are still very much possible, and like a lot of people, I'm sure, I've been watching the election returns as they're updated. So still really close margins in places like Nevada and Wisconsin and Michigan. There's a lot of discussion before last night about how what was going on in the election returns would depend a lot on which state we're talking about and what order they count things in. And that was certainly, so we see Biden jump out to a lead in places like Florida and Texas, and that quickly fades as early votes are replaced by election day votes, whereas the opposite seems to be happening in Wisconsin and Michigan, where if you were looking at the results late last night, it might look like Trump had a big margin there. And now as of 10:18 this morning,
right.
Like there are leads of about 10 to 20,000 for Biden in both Wisconsin and Michigan, which if those were to hold would be combined with Arizona and the potentially critical congressional district in Nebraska would be enough to get him to 270, regardless of what happens in Pennsylvania, where we may be waiting for quite a while for final outcomes in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, just a few moments before we hopped on in Philadelphia, which is obviously really important to Joe Biden. They still have over 200,000 votes that they're counting today. And they have continually said, look, we're going to count every single one of these. We're going to give you updates when we can, but we're not just going to rush this out. Obviously, last night, both of the candidates spoke. President Trump declared a premature victory, falsely saying he was ahead in a few of these states where, like you said, there was simply not enough information out there to make a call, and still isn't in many of these places. Joe Biden said he feels good about where he's at. He said that They really feel good about Pennsylvania. They feel okay about Wisconsin and Michigan, which, as you mentioned, have come around to Biden's lead earlier this morning. Was there anything that the candidates said or did yesterday that stood out to you? And as we look forward here, what do you think people can expect from them if the results are still close as we come through the day? If places like Pennsylvania and Nevada aren't clear and we still need to know those results before we can declare a president?
Yeah, so Biden's remarks last night were pretty conventional, I thought. Basically, we feel good about where we are. We're going to wait to count all the votes. You might hear Al Gore or George W. Bush say the same things back in 2000. Trump's comments and tweet, on the other hand, were pretty unconventional, a reflection of an unconventional presidency, and pretty controversial. I was checking on Twitter, and Twitter had moderated that tweet. I think news media organizations in general have been pretty cautious, and I noticed in your own comments, you labeled it as a false claim. I think that's been the prevailing news media treatment of that, which a candidate in the midst of counting votes, claiming that the election is fraudulent and the counting of the votes should stop, is pretty outside the bounds of what we typically see in American political discourse.
And it was sort of a move that he telegraphed in the days leading up to the election. So maybe news organizations were a little more prepared to say, okay, we're going to handle this with this particular phrasing or approach, if it's indeed what he does. And then it was pretty much in line with what the campaign had been saying.
Yeah, big credit to Jonathan Swan of Axios, which is he was the reporter who initially broke this story a few days ago. And the script that Trump used last night was very, very similar to what that news organization said that he would do.
Exactly. For Trump, I think a lot of what you might have been following, the people who are viewing us now, sort of frame things through the view of what does Biden need for this win. But heading into Tuesday, before we had any of these results, Biden was the front runner. Trump was the upset. Is maybe the most likely, or let's say Michigan and Wisconsin, who are trending in Biden's direction, go there. What does Trump need to pull off what would be an upset, even though he is the incumbent president? What could happen that could still give Trump this win?
Yeah, so, Pennsylvania, there's so much that we don't know yet, so many outstanding votes, that he needs that to break his way. With Michigan and Wisconsin, it's harder to see on paper how he, the shift, the blue shift in those states has been pretty strong. And Wisconsin is pretty much, there's still a few results trickling in, but we have a pretty good sense of how Wisconsin's turned out. It's a close margin, so it's too early to call that. But, there's not an obvious place where Trump's going to make up ground. My understanding is most of the outstanding votes in Michigan are in the Detroit area. If that is correct, then that's going to be good for Biden and not so good for Trump. So that's one route where Trump could somehow defy expectations in those two states. The other route would be to delegitimize the outcome and or challenge it somehow through the court system, which, again, Trump said last night that he was going to try to take this to the Supreme Court. I'm not sure what legal premise or legal theory would be the rationale there, but Trump is certainly trying to promote a narrative that he's the winner and that any other outcome is an illegitimate outcome.
If you're just joining us, we're speaking with the University of Delaware's Paul Brewer, breaking down everything that has happened and what could be to come pertaining to the presidential election. But I want to switch gears here just for a moment to what we saw in Delaware. And one of the biggest takeaways was record-breaking turnout. Throughout the morning, we reported lines of up to an hour and a half, 2 hours at polling places across Delaware, even late into the evening. Some places in the Hockessin and Pike Creek area had lines up over an hour. And even before that, we saw 160,000 Delawareans cast mail or absentee ballots, which previously wouldn't be available to that many people if it weren't not for the COVID-19 pandemic. Was the turnout in Delaware something you expected? And did you see anything else with that stood out to you yesterday?
Yes, it was expected because so we certainly live in polarized partisan times. And that creates challenges for compromising getting things done, perhaps, but it's also very motivating for a lot of voters. And so if people see this as the most important election of a lifetime, that's a pretty good reason to go to the polls. And what happened in Delaware is part of a bigger national pattern. We don't have the final vote tallies yet, but the estimates I'm seeing suggest that nationally, turnout of the voting eligible population might be somewhere around 67%, which would make it the highest level of turnout since 1900.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. And being at polling places as we were, I think that energy was palpable. We had a lot of people saying, I didn't vote in previous elections, or this is my first time voting, and I feel like I have to do something. Both on both sides, people saying we can't leave this in the hands of Joe Biden, and other people saying I've had enough over the last 4 years. Statewide races, Democrats continued to control them. John Carney wins re-election at the governor's seat. Lisa Blunt Rochester, the representative, Chris Coons in the Senate race. What stood out to you there?
What stood out for me actually was how similar all these statewide outcomes were. I was really paying close attention to see, would, for example, Julianne Murray run ahead of Lauren Witzke? Would there be any bright spots for the Delaware GOP in the statewide races? And really, the results are remarkably similar across all of these races, even though you could argue that some of the candidates are substantially different. The kind of message that Witzke was putting out is pretty different from the more mainstream state party endorsed messages from Lee Murphy, for example, or Julianne Murray. So it seems like statewide races have been very much, it's very much all, voters are looking at these all in the same framework. So how Biden did, or how Coons did, or how Carney did, all the way down to how Trinidad and Navarro did. So not a lot of daylight there. And it really creates a question, I think, what, if anything, could the Delaware Republican Party do to be competitive at a statewide level? If there is an answer to that question, it certainly was not on display in this election.
Yeah, you spoke a little bit about the differences between those candidates, and I know my colleague Isabel Hughes asked you about this pertaining to Lauren Witzke's race against Chris Coons. Which direction, if you will, and maybe it's not as binary as that question would pose it, but is there a direction that the Republican Party could go to gain more traction? So the direction of Witzke, which would be certainly more extreme, but more Trumpian, if you will, or somebody like Lee Murphy, who would be a little bit more conventional. Is there a path there, or kind of turning your question back to you? I know it's a difficult one, but what could the Republicans do to gain more traction here in the first state?
Yeah, so I think Witzke's approach is a really challenging one for a state like Delaware, which is pretty solidly blue overall, as we saw last night. It didn't seem to hurt her compared to candidates like Lee Murphy and Julianne Murray. And maybe what's going on there is that, those candidates might not come across as fringy, perhaps, but they've certainly not bridged the gap or motivated motivated voters to look at a Republican candidate. And really, I think the only way the Republican Party might win is to find their own Larry Hogan or Charlie Baker or Phil Scott, a Republican candidate who has significant crossover appeal to independent voters and even some Democratic voters. Whether that kind of candidate can have the resources to win and come out of a Republican primary is a separate question. I think the Republican Party as an institution might have preferred a different candidate to Lauren Witzke, but the state party endorsed candidate lost narrowly to her. And so her message might not resonate with the general election electorate in Delaware, but it seemed to resonate with primary voters for Republicans.
One of the other trends that we tracked during the primaries, and you kind of see come to fruition yesterday, is a progressive wave, if you will, in the state legislature. Moving forward, how, if at all, do you see that impacting the direction of the Democrats at the statewide level, who in Carney and Coons, names like that, would be considered more moderate compared to some of the names that were elected yesterday?
Yeah, so there were there are going to be a few fresh faces in the legislature. You got Sarah McBride, for example, and I'm a little sleepy, so I might get some names wrong. Eric Morrison, I believe, won, and he'll be a new state representative, along with Medina Wilson Anton.
Yep.
So three kind of all kind of striking personal stories and maybe more progressive politics. And Sarah McBride, I think, has gotten some national exposure, and
Sure.
maybe a future star in Delaware politics. Certainly a politician to keep an eye on. And they're the kinds of new faces in the legislature that might push, a more moderate political figure like Carney. Uh, I was keeping my eye on some of the legislative races last night. Correct me if I'm wrong. It looked like the Democrats picked up 2 Senate seats and 1 new representative seat that they picked off from the Republicans.
I believe that's the case. Definitely the 2 Senate seats.
Yeah, so not a dramatic shift, but padding that margin, which has gotten wider and wider over the past few cycles, if I'm not mistaken, in the Senate. And that means that the Democratic majority in the Senate, they can afford to lose 1 or 2 more moderate members and still pass things and send it to the governor.
Yeah, and with the Senate, the only 2 remaining Republicans in Newcastle County, those were the 2 that lost. So all Democrats in Newcastle County, and then a few Republicans in the southern part of the state. If you're just joining us, I'm Brandon Holveck with the News Journal, speaking with UD's Paul Brewer to get you set for Election Day Part 2, if you will. As someone who conducts these polls, who studies the figures, you research this a lot. I want to know about your approach to watching Election Day. Like, what do you look out for? Are you watching cable news? Are you watching national newspaper type media outlets? How do you consume Election Day, and what do you look for as everything unfolds?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm a cord cutter, so I have not been watching cable news coverage lately. Instead, I've been doing a combination of, I use a lot of Twitter. I have, some kind of election experts. For example, if you're trying to figure out what's going on in Nevada, there's no person better to follow than John Ralston of Ralston Reports in Nevada. So there's a lot of great sources on Twitter. I've been following a lot of different news sources, from Fox News to Bloomberg to the New York Times. The New York Times had the Needle, which in the case of Georgia especially really kind of shifted back and forth.
Yeah.
Fox News is interesting, called Arizona pretty early relative to other media organizations, which I think created quite a bit of consternation in the White House and pushback, but they stuck to that call. So, I think for any audience members out there, I would recommend a diversity of sources, and sources that provide kind of specialized information as well. For example, if you're just looking at election returns in a place like Pennsylvania, you might look at it and say, oh, Donald Trump has a pretty big lead there. But digging deeper into it, you really have to understand in what order is Pennsylvania counting the votes, and what parts of the state have reported vote tallies and which ones haven't, to get a fuller understanding of what's going on in the election outcomes.
So today, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, all these states are on the table. If you can put your prediction cap on here, what do you think will be the first to fall as we wrap up?
Yeah, well, I think Wisconsin is, I think all of the major kind of dumps of votes have come in Wisconsin. It's too early to call that state because it's a close margin, and still within 1%, which I believe would give the eventual loser the chance to call for a recount. So it wouldn't be responsible to say that anybody's won that yet. But Wisconsin, I don't necessarily expect a lot new to happen there. I think the outcome we're seeing there might be pretty close to the final outcome that we get. I think Georgia has started to report votes. The major votes out there from the reporting I'm seeing are going to be coming from Fulton County and DeKalb County, which are basically Atlanta and close in Atlanta suburbs. So we might have a clearer picture of what's going on in Georgia by the end of the day. Michigan has been coming in the early hours of the morning, and there have been big shifts there. I think the Michigan election officials say that they are going to be done counting sometime today. Pennsylvania, just forget about it. We might get a clearer sense of what's going on there, but in terms of any kind of final outcome in Pennsylvania, that is not happening today, pretty sure.
All right. Well, we'll be following it all as best we can. Delaware Online, we have live updates running. I think the latest is the Biden campaign just spoke a few moments ago about what they're seeing today. So we'll have that up for you, as well as breakdowns of everything that happened that we discussed here yesterday, the state races, the turnout. We have stories on all of those that you can check out, I believe, for free under our election tab. So go get it while you can at DelawareOnline.com. Paul, thank you so much for your insight and for helping us break this all down.
Thanks for having me on here. It's certainly going to be a lot to follow over the next few days.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening, watching.